Snow fell like sifted ash over the town square, soft but relentless, each flake catching the lantern glow before sinking into the hard earth. The crowd huddled close in wool coats and furs, breath rising in pale clouds that mingled with the drifting whiteness. In the middle of it all stood Elizabeth Carter, 24, tall and straight-backed despite the chains of shame curling through her chest. Her long figure rose above the auction block's wooden rail, and the people gathered below craned their necks not in admiration, but in cruel delight. "She's too tall for any man," a woman whispered, and the words scurried like rats through the crowd. Laughter followed, quick and sharp, cutting through the stillness of snow. Elizabeth's cheeks burned as cold air stung her skin, but she did not lower her gaze. She had learned long ago that bending made the ridicule worse, as though shame were a posture others expected her to wear. Sheriff Amos Burke stood at the edge of the platform, his badge gleaming dully under the lantern light. He was a thick man with weathered jowls, his voice loud enough to echo against the saloon walls. "This one here," he declared, pointing toward Elizabeth as though she were cattle, "ain't wanted by kin nor suitors. But tall women got their uses. Who'll take her?" The men chuckled, tossing figures back and forth, coins clinking in their palms. Some spoke in jest, bidding the price of a mule or a barrel of whiskey. Elizabeth's younger brother, Samuel, lingered near the edge of the square, his hat pulled low. When their eyes met, he turned away, shoulders hunched. He could not, or would not, stand for her. That wound cut deeper than the laughter, leaving her breath thin and unsteady in the cold. She closed her eyes for a moment. Snowflakes landed on her lashes, melting into faint streams against her cheeks. She could hear the jeering men, the drawling bids, but beneath it ran the sound of her own pulse, a hollow, steady drum reminding her she was still alive. She tried to remember her mother's voice, soft as cotton, saying she was a tree meant for the sky. But even that memory, worn thin by ridicule, seemed to splinter tonight. Clara May Jenkins, sharp-faced and eager for gossip, leaned toward another woman, her voice carrying, "A man ought not marry a woman he has to crane his neck to kiss. That's God's order, plain as day." Elizabeth felt the sting of those words more than the cold. They dressed her height as a sin, a curse, a mark that stripped her of worth. Sheriff Amos barked again. $2? $1.50. He raised his hand impatiently, as if even this humiliation weren't worth his time. A man in a stained coat snorted, "I'll give $1 for sport." The crowd erupted in cruel laughter, and Elizabeth's shoulders trembled. She pressed her fingers against the rough wood of the rail, steadying herself. The snow thickened, veiling the square in pale quiet, but the laughter pierced through. It seemed she stood suspended between two worlds, the tender hush of snowfall and the sharp cruelty of voices. In that space, time slowed. She wondered if she might vanish into the whiteness, if the earth might swallow her tall frame and hide her away. Then, a silence rippled. The laughter faltered. Boots crunched through the snow at the far edge of the square, slow, deliberate steps. A tall figure emerged from the veil of white, a man whose presence seemed to bend the air around him. His hair, streaked white though his face was not yet old, glistened with snow. He wore a long dark coat, fringed with frost, and his eyes held the weight of storms weathered. It was Nantan, known to some as White Hawk, a name whispered with equal parts fear and reverence. An Apache, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that silenced jeers without a word. The men shuffled, uncertain whether to mock or hold their tongues. Sheriff Amos stiffened. "This ain't for the likes of." Nanton's hand cut the air, not harsh but firm. He drew a pouch from beneath his coat and tossed it onto the platform. The coins spilled, bright against dark wood, more than the sheriff had expected for any woman. The sound rang louder than the jeers had, and the square fell still. Elizabeth lifted her gaze. For the first time that night, her eyes met something other than ridicule. His expression was unreadable, carved in calm stone, yet his presence carried neither pity nor contempt. He looked at her as though she were simply a woman standing in snow, not a spectacle, not a sin. Sheriff Amos cleared his throat, discomfort pinching his voice. "Well, sold then." He stepped aside, eager to retreat from the quiet power that had entered his square. Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled as the moment closed around her. She had been sold like a mule, her shame displayed for the town. But when Nantan stepped forward, his movements unhurried, she felt the weight shift. He did not seize her arm or drag her from the platform. Instead he reached out, lifting her down from the block as though she were fragile glass. His hands, scarred but steady, supported her with care. The crowd watched in silence. Snow continued its patient descent, covering boots, hats, and shoulders, muffling the whispers that tried to stir again. Elizabeth trembled, not from cold now, but from the sudden strangeness of being handled gently. He leaned close enough that only she could hear, his voice low, carrying the cadence of mountains and rivers. "You're perfect for my arms." Her breath caught. All the jeers, the gossip, the laughter, they scattered like startled birds into the snow-heavy night. She searched his face, but he did not smirk nor gloat. His eyes were steady, as though he had simply spoken a truth. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, some muttering, others staring. Samuel was nowhere in sight. He had vanished into the snow. Clara May's mouth hung open, but no words came. Sheriff Amos busied himself gathering coins, avoiding the weight of what had just unfolded. Elizabeth, still trembling, looked at the tall Apache beside her. Her shame and the night's cruelty pressed heavy, yet beneath it pulsed something else, something she could not name. It was not rescue, nor ownership. It was a beginning, carved into snowfall. As Nantan guided her through the crowd, their footsteps muffled in fresh snow, Elizabeth's heart beat against her ribs with fierce confusion. She had been mocked, sold, discarded by her own kin. Yet in the silence of his words, in the steady support of his arm, a seed of defiance stirred, fragile, trembling, but alive. And though the crowd's whispers trailed behind, fading into the snowfall, Elizabeth felt the first fragile warmth of a truth she had never known. That perhaps her height was not her curse but her measure, and that someone at last might see it not as shame, but as belonging. The cabin stood against the slope of the mountain like a darkened lantern, its roof burdened with snow, its chimney exhaling smoke that dissolved into the night. Inside, warmth pressed against the windows, firelight flickering in restless patterns upon log walls. Elizabeth sat near the hearth, her tall frame wrapped in a wool blanket, her hands folded in her lap as though she dared not disturb the silence. The air smelled of pine smoke and venison stew, though she could not eat. Hunger had less weight than the tangle of shame that still knotted inside her, the echo of laughter in the town square clinging as stubbornly as frost. Nantan moved about the cabin with unhurried steps, as though silence were his native tongue. He stoked the fire, set a wooden bowl on the table, brushed snow from his coat. He had not spoken since lifting her down from the platform, not even on the long ride through storm and dark, where hoofbeats and the hiss of snow had been the only voices. Elizabeth had not known what to expect. Chains, commands, the kind of ownership men in town imagined when they laughed. Yet here, in the flicker of this solitary place, she found no grasping hands, no demands. Only space, heavy with unspoken thought. Her eyes wandered to him, to the way his hair, streaked white, caught the glow. His face bore lines not of age alone, but of burdens carried through winters past. When he bent to place logs on the fire, she saw scars etched across his hands, faded and pale, a history written in flesh. She looked away quickly, ashamed to have studied him so long. Still, the image lingered, unsettling her with a question she could not yet name. The crackle of the fire filled the cabin, punctuated by the soft moan of wind pressing against the walls. Elizabeth let her gaze fall to the floorboards, worn smooth by years of steps, perhaps by another woman's hands sweeping dust and ash. She wondered if he had built this place with those scarred palms, if laughter had once lived here. The thought ached inside her, though she could not explain why. When at last he turned to her, she felt her breath catch. He did not study her as the crowd had, tallying faults like a ledger. He merely gestured toward the bowl on the table, his voice quiet but firm, shaped by an accent heavy as stone. "Eat." One word, offered not as order, but as invitation. Elizabeth hesitated. Her pride, worn raw by the auction, wanted to resist. Yet hunger pricked her, and the steadiness of his gaze gave no room for mockery. She rose, awkward in her blanket, and sat at the rough-hewn table. The stew was simple, meat, onion, potato, but the warmth spread through her chest with startling force. He did not join her. Instead, he sat opposite, mending a leather strap, his hands moving with patient rhythm. She lifted her eyes once, catching him watching not her face, but the way she held the spoon. It was not judgment, more like curiosity, or perhaps recognition. Her throat tightened. She set the spoon down, folding her hands. You bought me." The words tasted bitter, scraped raw. He did not look up immediately. Only after the thread tightened on the strap did he speak. "I gave silver." His tone was neither boast nor excuse. Then he raised his eyes, steady, dark. "But you are not a thing." The fire popped, showering sparks against the iron grate. Elizabeth's lips parted, but no reply came. She had expected chains, but not this. She had braced for ownership, not dignity. She wanted to ask why he had lifted her, why he had spoken those words on the stage. Yet shame held her tongue, the memory of laughter still blistering. He returned to his work. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It felt instead like deep snow, muffling the noise of a world too cruel, making space for breath. Later, when he rose to fetch more wood, Elizabeth drifted to the window. Snow pressed against the glass, pale under the moon, a world hushed and unforgiving. She saw her reflection faintly, tall and sharp against the frost. The old humiliation stirred again. Too tall for a woman, too strange, too much. Her shoulders sagged and she whispered, almost without breath, "Why was I born this way?" The words vanished into the crackle of fire, yet she felt him pause behind her. She did not turn, but she knew he had heard. A long silence passed before his voice came, low and rough as winter stone. "The hawk flies higher than the crow. The sky was made for it." Elizabeth closed her eyes, pressing her palm against the window's cold pane. Tears rose, hot against her lashes, though she fought them back. His words settled into her bones, not as comfort, but as a weight she had never been asked to carry, the possibility that her curse was not won. When she turned, he was already laying fresh logs by the door, his back to her, offering no demand for thanks, no smugness at her surprise. Only silence again, vast and steady. That night, she lay on a narrow bed, the blanket rough against her chin. From the other room came the muted sound of his movements, the creak of a chair, the steady breath of a man at rest. Elizabeth stared into the dark, every nerve alive with unease. She had been sold. She should feel nothing but bitterness. Yet the memory of his hands lifting her, careful as if she might break, returned again and again. His words, "You are not a thing," echoed louder than the town's laughter. She tried to summon anger, but what rose instead was something stranger. The faintest bloom of safety, fragile as a candle in storm. She pressed her face into the blanket, whispering to herself that she would not trust it. Yet her body, weary from humiliation and snow, surrendered to sleep with that flickering warmth still trembling in her chest. And just before her eyes closed, she thought she heard the sound of a chair shifting near her door, as though he had chosen to keep watch. The town was never quiet for long. Words carried quicker than wagons, faster than the creek in flood. By the time Elizabeth stepped once more across its snowpacked street, whispers already followed her, slipping from doorways and drifting over hitching rails. Heads turned the way sunflowers bend toward light, only here it was scorn that drew them. Her height alone had always been enough to stir gossip, but now, with the Apache's coat across her shoulders, the whispers sharpened into blades. "There she is," hissed Clara May Jenkins, her bonnet tilted low, her mouth tight with relish. "Tall as a man, and taken in by a savage." The word hung like smoke in cold air, foul and lingering. Beside her, another woman clucked, eyes narrowing. "Sold like a mule and still walking proud. Lord help her soul." Their voices were pitched just high enough to pierce Elizabeth's ears. Elizabeth kept her chin raised, though her chest burned. Every step on the frozen boards sounded louder than her breath. She could feel the crowd's eyes measuring her again. Too long, too tall, too much. But beside her walked Nantan, silent, unflinching, his stride steady as the mountain. His gaze did not stray toward the whispers. He carried a bundle of trade goods as though the crowd did not exist. And still, their silence seemed louder than any defense. The blacksmith paused mid-strike, hammer hovering over iron. A pair of boys darted between barrels, whispering and laughing. Elizabeth's throat tightened. All her life she had lived under the gaze of others, yet now the weight was doubled by the company she kept. Her shame and his presence braided together, a tether that made her both less alone and more exposed. At the Mercantile, Sheriff Amos leaned against the rail, his badge gleaming like cold brass. He spat into the snow before speaking, his voice heavy with threat disguised as courtesy. "Carter girl," he drawled. "You keepin' house out there for your new master?" The word curled bitter on his tongue. Elizabeth froze, heat flashing through her despite the cold. Nanton's eyes, dark and unyielding, fixed on the sheriff. The silence stretched until even the horses stamped nervously. Then Nantan spoke, his voice calm but iron-strong. "She belongs to no man. She is free." The sheriff's lip twitched, his jaw working as if to chew down his anger. "Careful how you say things in this town. Folks don't take kindly to such arrangements." His gaze swept the crowd as if to summon agreement. Yet no one answered, only murmurs rippled like wind over prairie grass. Elizabeth wanted to speak, to find words that could shield them both, but fear pinned her tongue. She hated that silence, hated herself for letting others paint her shame while she stood voiceless. Her hands trembled inside the borrowed coat, but Nanton's calm presence at her side steadied her enough to keep walking. Later, at the edge of town, an older woman caught her arm. It was Mrs. Hattie Rowe, widow of 20 years, her eyes lined by both sorrow and kindness. "Child," she whispered, glancing toward Nantan before pulling Elizabeth a step aside. "They'll talk, because that's what small souls do. But don't you bow your head. You're taller than they'll ever be, in ways they can't see." Her wrinkled hand pressed Elizabeth's tightly, then released. Elizabeth's heart swelled with a fragile warmth she hadn't expected. That night back in the cabin, Elizabeth scrubbed the floorboards on her knees, needing to carve the day's shame out of her skin with labor. Nantan watched for a moment, then quietly set a bucket near her. He did not ask her to stop. His silence was not dismissal, but a kind of respect, as though he knew she needed to fight her ghosts in her own way. When her arms ached, she sat back, breath harsh, and found him repairing a chair leg with the same patient steadiness as before. His presence carried no judgment, and that simple mercy stung more sweetly than words. When sleep finally came, dreams tangled her mind with voices of the town. Clara May's sneer, Sheriff Amos's insinuation, her brother's silence. Samuel's absence gnawed worst of all. He had not spoken to her since that night, and in her heart she felt the wound of his rejection deeper than any gossip. Blood should have stood by her, yet he had turned away. It was days later when Samuel finally came. She saw him ride up the path, snow dusting his hat, his face drawn. Elizabeth's chest tightened with hope and fear as she stepped onto the porch. He dismounted stiffly, eyes flicking toward Nantan who stood at her side. Samuel's jaw clenched. "Lizzie," he said, voice taut with shame. "You've disgraced us. Folks are saying you're living like his squaw." His words cracked like a whip, harder because they came from family. Elizabeth's hands gripped the porch rail. Her tongue felt heavy, her throat raw. She wanted to cry, to plead that she had not chosen this fate, that she was only trying to survive. But the words would not come. Behind her, she felt Nanton's presence, tall and steady, saying nothing, offering only his silent strength. "Come home," Samuel urged, though his eyes darted away, unwilling to truly meet hers. "You can still save your name if you leave now." Elizabeth's heart thundered. The shame that had followed her all her life surged hot, colliding with the fragile dignity she had begun to find here. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Samuel's gaze hardened at her silence. He shook his head, bitterness spilling in his tone. "Then you're no sister of mine." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode back down the snowy path without looking back. The sound of hooves faded into the white hush of evening. Elizabeth stood frozen, her chest burning with the wound his words carved. For a moment she swayed, her knees threatening to give. Then she felt it, the quiet weight of a hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Nantan had not spoken, not moved forward with any claim. Just that hand, steady, asking nothing, grounding her as the world splintered again. Tears burned in her eyes, spilling hot into the cold night. She lifted her gaze toward the dark treeline, where snowflakes drifted slow against the last glow of sky. Her brother's rejection hollowed her, yet beneath the pain flickered a strange, defiant strength. For the first time, she did not shrink. She straightened, tall against the storm, and let the tears fall without shame. Nanton's hand lingered, then withdrew. Elizabeth turned her head, searching his face. In the firelight spilling through the cabin door, she thought she saw something unspoken in his eyes. Not possession, not pity, but recognition. The night closed around them, snow whispering against the eaves. Elizabeth drew a breath, long and unsteady, and in that breath felt the shift of something breaking free inside her. The faint beginning of belonging, even if the world outside called it disgrace. The storm arrived with a fury that made the mountains groan. Snow lashed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters, while the wind howled as though it sought to rip the roof free. Inside, the fire sputtered and roared, a fragile fortress of light against the vast dark. Elizabeth sat by the hearth, her hands folded tightly, her breath shallow as though she might steady the world by holding herself still. When the door blew open, a gust of snow burst inside, carrying with it the staggering figure of Nantan. He hauled a bundle of split logs, his shoulders dusted white, his breath streaming in harsh clouds. Elizabeth sprang to her feet, shock piercing her chest. He had been outside all this time, battling the storm to keep them warm. His coat was soaked, his hands raw and red. "You'll freeze," she cried, voice sharper than she intended. She seized the door, shoving it shut with her weight until the latch caught. When she turned, he stood dripping by the hearth, his hair wild with snow, his chest rising like a bellows. His silence was steady, but she could see the tremor in his fingers. Without thinking, she hurried to him. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she pulled it free and wrapped it around his back. For the first time since she had come to this cabin, she touched him without fear. Her hands pressed against the solid weight of him, the cold seeping through fabric. His body was stone beneath her palms, yet the shiver that ran through him was human, vulnerable. He lowered the logs and sank to the chair, his breath slowing. Elizabeth knelt at his side, her fingers clumsy as she reached for his hands. The skin was raw, split in places where the frost had bitten deep. She drew them close to the fire, her own trembling fingers cupping his. Her tears fell before she knew they had risen. "You could have died out there," she whispered. His eyes lifted, dark and unwavering, though softened by weariness. "The fire must live," he said. The words were simple, yet carried the weight of his years, of duty that did not falter even in storm. Elizabeth bowed her head over his hands. She had never been tended to with such quiet care, yet here she was, tending him. A strange warmth filled her chest, not from fire, but from the breaking of a wall inside her. All her life she had been told she was too tall, too much, not fit for arms or hearth. Yet here, in the hush of snow and flame, her height bent to no shame. She was kneeling, yes, but not in disgrace, only in choice. Nanton's voice came again, quieter, as if the storm outside demanded reverence. "Once I had a wife. A daughter." His gaze flicked toward the flames. "Both taken in a raid, many winters ago. Since then, this cabin has been only silence." His breath shuddered faintly, though his tone did not waver. "Snow takes. Fire remembers." Elizabeth's throat closed. She had not expected such words from him, not the fracture of grief revealed beneath his stone. Slowly, she placed her palm against his scarred hand, no longer merely tending his wounds, but answering them. "I have carried shame all my life," she murmured. "They mocked me as a girl. No man would claim me. My own brother turned away." Her chest heaved, the words spilling like water from a broken dam. "I believed I was cursed to walk taller than any love would reach." The fire hissed as a log split, showering sparks upward. In their light, Nanton's gaze met hers. He did not speak of curses or blessings. He did not argue her worth. He simply held her eyes steady, as if her words deserved no denial, only recognition. That silence, the dignity of it, was more than comfort. It was belief, unspoken yet undeniable. Her hand lingered on his, and his fingers closed around hers, slow and sure. The air between them thickened, not with demand, but with the fragile birth of something neither dared name. Elizabeth's breath slowed, her pulse steadying under his touch. She realized she was no longer trembling. Outside, voices broke the storm. Shouts carried faintly over the wind, men's laughter twisting cruel against the night. Elizabeth stiffened, rising to the window. Lanterns bobbed through the snow, figures riding past the cabin. The voices jeered, flinging insults sharp enough to pierce the walls. "Savage's woman!" One cried. Rocks struck against wood, dull thuds that made her flinch. Her hands gripped the sill. The shame that had hounded her swelled, pressing against her ribs, demanding she shrink, hide, vanish. Yet when she looked back, she saw Nantan standing in the doorway, broad frame lit by firelight. He had not moved to close the shutters, nor to answer the taunts. He simply stood, unflinching, his silence louder than their cruelty. Elizabeth felt the storm inside her collide with the storm outside. For the first time, she did not bow her head. She stepped to the doorway, her tall figure beside his. Snow whirled around them, firelight spilling onto the threshold. Her heart thundered, yet her chin rose. She faced the shadows beyond, her breath steady. The riders slowed, startled perhaps by the sight of her standing firm. The insults faltered, caught in their throats. Elizabeth felt the heat of Nantan's presence beside her, not shielding her, but sharing the stance. No words passed between them, yet the message was carved into the night. She would not hide, and he would not let her stand alone. At last the riders turned, their lanterns fading into storm. The cabin settled again into quiet, the wind muffling their retreat. Elizabeth's chest heaved, but she did not collapse. Instead, she turned to Nantan, her face pale with both fear and newfound strength. Her voice came, fragile but resolute. "I cannot be less than what I am." Nantan's gaze held hers, the firelight carving the lines of his face, and for the first time she thought she saw not only dignity but a quiet, aching hope. His hand rose slowly, brushing snow from her sleeve, a gesture so small yet so profound it burned deeper than any declaration. Elizabeth's breath caught, her heart pounding in the silence between them. The shame she had carried felt lighter, though not gone, like snow beginning to melt under flame. She could not yet name what had begun, but she knew the night had changed her. The storm raged on, yet inside the cabin the fire burned steady, and when she turned from the doorway, she knew the silence they shared was no longer emptiness. It was becoming something else. And just before she closed the shutters, she felt his eyes upon her, steady, unwavering, as though he had already seen the choice she would one day make. The snow lay deep across the valley, smoothing every ridge and fence line into silence. Morning came gray, the air sharp with a cold that seemed to cut straight to the bone. Elizabeth stood at the cabin window, her breath clouding the glass as she watched the endless white. She had grown used to the hush of this place, the solitude, the sound of logs splitting under Nantan's axe. Yet beneath the peace beat a steady unease, for the storm of men was never far behind the storm of weather. The knock came not with hands but with hoofbeats, distant at first, then louder, until the rhythm of horses pressed like a drum against her chest. Elizabeth's heart quickened. She knew before she saw them. Sheriff Amos rode at the front, his dark coat blending with the clouds, a knot of townsmen behind him. Their figures moved like shadows cutting across the snow. Nantan stepped from the woods with an armful of kindling, his breath rising steady in the cold. His eyes lifted at the sound, narrowing. Without hurry, he laid the wood down and moved toward the cabin. Elizabeth opened the door, the chill spilling in around her. "They're coming," she whispered. He nodded once, his face a mask carved from calm stone. "Then we will meet them." The riders drew up before the porch, snow kicking from hooves, lanterns swaying in the gray light. Sheriff Amos dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching in the snow. He looked up at Elizabeth, his mouth tightening into a line both stern and smug. "Carter girl," he called, his voice cutting the stillness. "We've come to bring you home. Folks don't take kindly to your arrangement here. The law's clear enough, you can't be kept. Elizabeth gripped the doorframe, her tall figure stiff with defiance, though her heart pounded. Behind her, Nantan stepped to the porch, broad shoulders filling the space beside her. His white-streaked hair caught the pale light, his presence casting the men below into unease. "I am not kept," Elizabeth said, her voice steady though her lips trembled. "I stay because I choose." A murmur swept through the men, some shifting uneasily in their saddles. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Choice or no, the town won't have it. You're comin' with us." He glanced at Nantan with open disdain. "Best step aside, savage. Don't make this harder." Nantan did not move. His silence was unyielding, a wall of stone against the storm. The men began to stir, hands brushing the grips of rifles, eyes flashing with the heat of fear disguised as authority. Elizabeth's breath faltered. Every instinct screamed to shrink back, to hide, to let the men decide her fate as they always had. But the memory of Firelight filled her, the warmth of tending his frostbitten hands, the quiet dignity of his grief shared with hers. She could not go back to chains of shame, not after standing in the doorway beside him. She stepped forward onto the porch, snow crunching under her boots. "You will not take me," she said, louder this time, her tall figure straight against the gray sky. "I was mocked, sold, cast out by my own blood. But I belong here, not because I was bought, not because I was claimed, but because I choose to stand where I am not small." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He raised a hand, and rifles lifted. The cold metal glinted, a terrible threat against the snow's hush. Elizabeth's chest tightened, but she did not move back. Instead, she felt Nantan's hand brush hers. No command, no force, only the grounding of touch. The sheriff barked, "Move, or be moved." In a flash, Nantan stepped down into the snow, his height towering over the men. A rifle was swung, but with a swift motion he wrenched it free, tossing it into the drift. The sudden display of strength jolted the line of men, their horses snorting and stamping. The sheriff stumbled back, fury sparking in his eyes. Elizabeth's heart thundered as she moved down the steps to stand at Nantan's side. Her breath came in sharp bursts, but she did not falter. Facing the rifles, she lifted her chin. "Shoot me if you must," she said, her voice ringing. "But I will not return to a life where I am only shame." The words pierced the cold air, echoing against the valley. The men shifted again, their confidence thinning. They had expected tears, begging, surrender. Not a woman who stood tall against rifles, not a figure who carried her height like a banner instead of a burden. The sheriff's hand trembled, caught between pride and doubt. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier force. He looked at the men, seeking agreement, but found only uneasy eyes, some avoiding his gaze entirely. The rifles lowered, slow, uncertain. At last, with a snarl, he spat into the snow. "Come on then." He mounted his horse, pulling the reins hard. The riders turned, one by one, their departure swallowed by the snowfall. The sound of hooves faded, leaving only the hush of wind and the thrum of Elizabeth's pulse. Silence reclaimed the valley. Elizabeth stood trembling, her breath fogging in quick bursts, her heart refusing to slow. Slowly, she turned to Nantan. His dark eyes met hers, steady as the mountains. She could not speak at first, the weight of what had passed pressed too heavy. Then she whispered, voice breaking but sure, "I am not too tall. I was only waiting for arms tall enough." His face did not change with surprise or triumph. Instead, he stepped closer, lifting a hand to brush a stray snowflake from her hair. His touch lingered, warm against the cold. No words passed, yet in his gaze she felt the truth of belonging, of dignity, restored not by the town's measure but by her own. Together they stepped back toward the cabin, the fire's glow spilling out to greet them. Elizabeth felt her chest ease, as though for the first time in years she could breathe without the weight of shame. The storm might return, the whispers might never cease, but something had shifted inside her that could not be undone. That night, as snow fell heavier and the fire burned low, Elizabeth sat near the hearth, her hand resting lightly over his. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty, it was full, alive, a space carved by choice and courage. Outside, the valley lay buried in white, but within the cabin, flame glowed against darkness, steady as a vow. And though the world beyond still judged, Elizabeth knew her place at last was not in their gaze, but in the strength of standing tall, unbowed, and chosen.